So thanks everyone for attending. Today I'm going to talk about, basically PFAS and wastewater. Do we try to treat it at POTWs, or do we look upstream and put in package plants at industrial hotspots? So there's, I'm business development manager for ECT2, which is Emerging Compounds Treatment Technologies. I'm based in Portland, Maine. So today, going to walk through tracking PFAS as it moves through our wastewater plants. I'm going to discuss, how we remove it from challenging water. So depending on what your other chemical characteristics are like, it can add complication. We're going to also look at industrial wastewater opportunity and a de-icing fluid opportunity that we've tackled in the past 12 months, and then conclude. So being conscious of time here, I'm going to move relatively quickly and assume that most folks on the call are familiar with PFAS and basic remediation techniques. And if you have any questions, happy to address them offline. So first, we're just going to kind of establish the baseline here. So this is from a case study in North Carolina. That picture on the bottom right is not North Carolina. That's overseas. I just think it's a really neat wastewater plant. But essentially for this study, we collected influent, or the person that ran this collected influent and effluent samples, tracking as that wastewater moved across the overall treatment plant. So the lag time was given for influent and effluent. We use TOPA to oxidize the samples and understand the total PFAS mass in the water. So TOPA essentially introduces a lot of energy, which moves all of the precursors into their terminal species. So it gives you a more accurate estimation or analysis of what type of PFAS is actually in your wastewater profile. So here you can see, which we thought to be interesting, was that initially more shorter chains were in the water. On the influent, and then on the effluent that had changed. So what's happening to those compounds? Are they binding with solids? Are they changing into other species? We'll talk about that. So here's, to dive in even further, your 6,2 FTS coming in, which is a precursor, was coming in almost at 2 parts per billion and was leaving the plant at just over 100 parts per trillion. So something's going on there, right? And then PFHXA, which is a terminal species, came in at 20 parts per trillion and then left the plant at 71. So the building blocks that make up PFHXA combined to create PFHXA during the wastewater process. And so understanding this, you can see that there's some complications when we look at treating PFAS at the wastewater treatment plant. So quick summary here. This is just to set up, kind of the discussion for the complications. But it biotransforms as it moves through. Removing from effluent discharge will be expensive. I mean, you're going to be talking about putting in billions of dollars in infrastructure nationally to take a look at removing PFAS from wastewater effluent streams. And we just need to understand both research on the baseline. So what are humans contributing, right? We can't expect wastewater plants to clean below those levels. And then what we're going to do about PFAS upstream. So if you're in a town or village with one industrial source that's contributing 95% of your PFAS to the wastewater plant, maybe it's more cost effective to install a system there as opposed to waiting for it to get combined with the sanitary sewer network and working its way through. So first off, we're going to talk about this airport. So these guys were in a town that had PFAS impact in their wastewater plant. They chose to go upstream and look at how to prevent some of that higher concentration PFAS from entering the sewer network. So here, essentially they use de-icing fluid. The de-icing fluid combines with PFAS that's in the groundwater from a different party that introduced that PFAS to the groundwater. And it picks it up as it moves through the collection system, and then it ends up in these storage lagoons. So the challenge here is to get a system out there, treat this lagoon water that has PFAS impact on it, and then discharge that to the sanitary sewer. So obviously there's some major complications with treating this lagoon water. There's a lot of biology and active life going on, which doesn't do well with media. So quite a bit of complications in the process. The solution here was one of our treatment plants. Initially, after receiving the PO, we deployed a pilot column, which you can see on the bottom left there, to understand how our process would work with this water. So by doing that, we were able to see some biogrowth and some pressure change across those columns, which allowed us to kind of tweak our design before we deployed to the field. So from purchase order to treated water, it was around 30 days. Really cool overall deployment, allowing us to get in understanding of what was going to happen to the plant before it got out there. So here's just some info on the piloting. We saw this biological growth happening on one of our resins. We therefore developed an organic dispersant that was both safe for the treatment plant and safe for the wastewater plant, right? You can't introduce something that's going to then kill all the activated sludge at the plant down the street. So really fun, technically challenging project that was really fast-paced and worked out well. Here's the total breakthrough. So you can see the influent PFAS concentrations between 50 and 200, 250 parts per trillion, and then effluent leaving our plant was at 0. So to date, we've treated all at non-detect levels. So the lessons learned here, pre-treatment is extremely important. As you're going to find with all media treatment, it's really important that that water is only seeing, or that treatment media is only seeing PFAS impacted water. Biogrowth can be a challenge, iron manganese can be issues. So got to make sure that your pre-treatment system is robust enough to prevent that media from getting clogged prematurely. So there's your overall solution. 12 gallons per minute is the average flow. It runs 24/7, treating down the lagoon wastewater. And again, just being conscious of time here. I know I'm moving through this very quickly, but we've got a lot of content in this short period. So for the industrial wastewater process, again, you've got a facility here that used PFAS in the manufacturing process. And how do we keep that out of the sanitary sewer? So the concentrations leaving this plant were between 500 parts per billion and 1 part per million. And the daily flow varied depending on what it was that they were manufacturing that day. So definitely added complicated challenges where when you're not treating as a constant stream, when it's a lot of batch processing, it adds to the variability and the challenge. So here we had some pretty challenging water matrix. Because of that batch process, we had up to 20,000 milligrams per liter of TDS, up to 8,000 milligrams per liter of TOC. I think most folks are familiar that TOC can occupy the same sites on carbon and resin that PFAS typically would. So it can really mess with your overall absorption and your life expectancy of the media. And there's really no way to know how that TOC is going to react because it's so broad that you really need to be on site to understand those ramifications. So for this one, we set up a pilot using carbon, single-use resin, and foam fractionation. Those are the 3 kind of technologies we looked at. And to not go into too depth, carbon relies heavily on adsorption. Ion exchange resin uses adsorption as well as ion exchange, so a bit of chemical attraction there with PFAS, and then foam fractionation I will talk about. So here's our first results from comparing carbon and resin as a solution. Really high variability in the water led to some super interesting performance data here. So because the influent wasn't necessarily consistent, it was hard to extrapolate out successful results. You would think, looking at the top graph for PFAS, that the resin did pretty well, which is the gray line, but then you look down at PFOA and we had some high hits right off the bat. So not really conclusive based on the initial pilot. So phase 2 was a foam fractionation. Essentially, this works by using bubbles to attract PFAS molecules. If you think about it, a lot of PFAS in the news you hear about is in firefighting foam, right? It likes to be on that air-water interface because of the charged head and the hydrophobic tail. So we can use that against the PFAS compounds and be able to remove them from water. So the initial influent was above 9 parts per billion, but after we foam fractionated, we were down to less than 80 parts per trillion. So here is the PFAS concentration versus foam fractionation time. So you can see that as we increased our dwell time, and then we introduced what we call our FF boost, or a foam increaser, we're able to get total removal of our total PFAS, or at least the ones that they were most interested in. So for this industrial case, we've got a full-scale foam fractionation pilot deploying hopefully in the next couple of weeks. The initial bench study will get indicated that we got enough PFAS removal for the facility to meet permit. At this facility site, they've got some interesting permits, and I'm not going to go into them just because it is site specific. But we're able to get down below the levels they need to be so that they can discharge their waste to the sanitary sewer. And then off that foam fractionation, it generates this really highly concentrated PFAS foam And that foam is then going to be run through our media products to eventually treat it before discharging that foam as a liquid. The eventual goal here is to, of course, couple with the destruction technology. So by concentrating up, kind of the opposite of solution to pollution is dilution, something about concentration in the situation, that's going to be the key to making these PFAS treatment technologies cost effective. So for here, PFAS treatment at the source can be more effective and less expensive than treating at the municipal level. If you're treating highly concentrated waste at 100 GPM, you're going to spend a lot less than if you're treating really dilute waste at 5 mgd. More data is needed to understand the background levels of PFAS at POTWs. I think it's important that when we start to enforce regulation, we know what we're talking about on a national basis. The difference in reporting levels between UCMR3 and where we're at now can lead to some skews in the reality. So we just got to make sure we completely understand that. And then not every industrial source is the same. So you're going to find that if you've got some complicated water, you're going to need a complicated solution. And that's it. With 1 minute to go, I can probably address 1 or 2 questions, Sarah, and then I'll hand it off.
Excellent. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, we do have time for questions. Absolutely. That was a great presentation.
How many PFAS did you analyze for in the post-treatment PFAS analysis?
I think we were doing 24. Typically with isotope dilution, you do 18, but I believe that client wanted to take a look at 24 compounds. I know that the EPA is now proposing 29 monitored, so we could move into that realm as well.
How did you ensure that on the, I think I missed one in between, I'm sorry. How did you ensure that on the fly developed organic dispersant would not affect the downstream activated sludge bench scale test?
We have a research and development lab in Rochester, New York. And so we were able to mess around with a couple different dispersants and understand how that would affect the biology downstream. So that was performed in-house, and then we were able to use our lab network to make sure there's toxicity there.
Do we have time for one more, Sarah?
We do, yeah, we do.
Okay. How do you dispose of PFAS that you've captured on the resin/carbon?
The cop-out answer is it works so well, you don't have to dispose of that frequently. But the real answer is that right now we've partnered with US Ecology. They're taking it to facilities that receive very little rainwater, so there's not much leachate to manage, and they have it at landfills. There are also solutions that include incineration, but we just got to make sure that we understand what's coming out of those stacks before you send your waste products there. So we've been advising clients to landfill at this time.
Thank you.
Were there any others? No. I have a quick question. We do have another minute. I'm kind of ignorant of how this works, right? Because you're in consulting and you're doing these projects for clients, and maybe this is a dumb question, but I don't care, and I'm going to ask it anyway. So you develop these technologies for clients, and then once you figure out that they are, that they work and that they're good, then what's the next step, right? Like, is a part of the process then licensing those technologies? Like, how does that work, I guess?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked. So we are a solutions provider. So we've got, 35 systems around the world that are treating PFAS right now. We've done over 1.4 billion gallons globally. Wow. So we've got a half dozen plants in Australia, and several here in the United States. So we actually run and operate plants, our treatment technology. We've got operators, but we also sell our solutions to, say, a wastewater plant or a drinking water plant, and they can run it with their own operators. So just kind of depends on the specific project, but yeah, we can go from beginning implementation and design all the way to producing the systems and then installing them and operating them.
Because I imagine that they're like proprietary information, right? Like, you're not publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. We do to some
level.
Right?
We do to some level, but there's so much intricacy with treating this PFAS, with treating it. I mean,
Sure.
We're measuring it part per trillion, which is 1 second in 42,000 years. So you really
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, really got to make sure you know what you're doing. So that's something that we're able to help clients with and provide a lot of value on because we've got the experience.
Great, that's good to know. I always wondered.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.